So Marvel Studios have always had a reputation for their impeccable approach to casting even the most minor roles in their shared universe, but Phase 1 wasn't without a couple of high-profile missteps. As impossible as it seems now, Terrence Howard was the highest-paid cast member of Iron Man, and the actor must have been kicking himself when his attitude saw him fired and replaced by the always reliable Don Cheadle. Edward Norton never really seemed like the ideal fit for the Hulk either, and with the actor having a notorious reputation for interfering during post-production processes on his movies, something that would have never been allowed to happen on Big Kev's watch, means that a lot of people agree that Mark Ruffalo was a vastly superior choice. But the point I'm trying to make is that recasting happens all the time in movies and TV shows for a variety of reasons, in everything from blockbuster franchises to lesser-known properties. And when it comes to hiring a new actor to play a character that's already well established, the choice needs to be right on the money, otherwise, well, you're going to be losing a lot of it. And that's what we're here to talk about today. As I'm Jules, this is Whatculture.com, and these are 10 major movie roles that were recast and made a lot worse. Number 10. The entire main cast. The Flintstones Viva Rock Vegas. 1994's live-action adaptation of The Flintstones is hardly an all-time classic, but it was a surprisingly huge hit at the box office, earning over $340 million, and it looked as though Universal had a franchise on their hands. Now, the movie isn't great, but one area that it did excel in was casting for the 4 lead roles. However, when John Goodman, Rick Moranis, Elizabeth Perkins, and Rosie O'Donnell opted not to return, the studio simply decided to recast them all and make the follow-up a prequel instead. Surprisingly, Viva Rock Vegas turned out to be even worse and only managed to earn a fraction of what its predecessor did, topping out at less than $60 million globally, with the B-list replacements paling in comparison to the more illustrious names that had previously played Fred, Wilma, Barney, and Betty. It surely couldn't have come as a shock to anyone at the studio that replacing proven and reliable talents with off-brand substitutes ultimately resulted in an inferior movie. Number 9. Julianne Moore, Hannibal. Julianne Moore is without a doubt one of the finest talents of her generation, but surely the actress knew what she was getting into when she agreed to step into the role of Clarice Starling for Ridley Scott's Hannibal. Jodie Foster scooped up an Academy Award for Best Actress for her iconic performance as the dogged FBI agent in Silence of the Lambs, and despite Anthony Hopkins returning as the title character and opting to chew on the scenery instead of his co-stars this time around, Hannibal was vastly inferior in every way. Moore did her best with the material, but didn't generate anything approaching the sparks of chemistry that Foster had shared with Hopkins, and Clarice was instead reduced to a much more paint-by-numbers protagonist that she'd been in her first outing under a different guise. Hannibal was a box office success after hauling in over $350 million, but despite the increase in commercial gains, everything else about the movie, well, it just did not live up. More, unfortunately, included. Number 8. George Lazenby, On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Over the decades, George Lazenby's one-and-done stint as James Bond in On Her Majesty's Secret Service has undergone something of a reappraisal from both fans and critics alike, and while he may have grown into the role had he stuck around a bit longer, the big Australian's performance remains more than a little wooden. Of course, it would have been a daunting task for any actor to have followed in the footsteps of Sean Connery, the charismatic tour de force who turned 007 into an icon. But while On Her Majesty's Secret Service deserves to be commended for making some big changes to both the style and the mythology of the Bond franchise, Lazenby's obvious inexperience as a leading man, well, it's hard to ignore. Admittedly, he gets a lot more dramatic heavy lifting to do in the story than anyone would have expected, but the unproven Lazenby struggles to put his stamp on Bond's latest reinvention and lacks even 1/10 of the charm that Connery brought to the role. Number 7. Ben Affleck and Chris Pine, the sum of all fears / Jack Ryan's shadow recruit. While the debate rages on over who made for the best live-action iteration of Jack Ryan, it would be fair to say that Ben Affleck and Chris Pine did not feature in that conversation. The superior version of Tom Clancy's literary creation is a clear 2-horse race between Alec Baldwin and Harrison Ford. Rebooting and focusing on Ryan's early years was a sensible, if rather uninspired, creative decision for the franchise, but neither Affleck nor Pine brought much to the role at all. It didn't help that the movies they starred in were nothing to write home about either, but in both The Sum of All Fears and Shadow Recruit, the leading man is about as bland and formulaic an action hero as you can get. John Krasinski is doing solid work on the Amazon exclusive version, and based on the last 2 reboots, Jack Ryan is probably much better served on the small screen anyway, as Paramount are surely running out of reboots by now, right? Number 6. Robert Burke, RoboCop 3. With the character spending most of his time with the majority of his face covered and heavy prosthetics required when it wasn't, the studio were probably hoping that a lot of people wouldn't even notice that Peter Weller had been replaced by Robert Burke in RoboCop 3. The production didn't even bother to build him a new suit, with Burke having to squeeze himself into the costume worn by the much smaller Weller. And that's not the only way his take on Murphy was a poor fit. In the prior actor's hands, the emotionless cyborg retained his humanity and vulnerability, but the third installment gave his replacement nothing to sink his teeth into, as the focus remained squarely on action scenes and selling toys at the expense of even trying to make a sequel that could stand up to the comparisons with the original. At least Burke was as robotic as the role required him to be, but the tagline is half man, half machine, all cop, and on that front, he failed to hit the remit. Number 5. Maria Bello, The Mummy: Tomb of the Dragon Emperor. Now, Stephen Sommers' The Mummy remains one of the most beloved adventure movies among fans of a certain generation, and while the sequel became preoccupied with ropey visual effects at the expense of the fun and light-hearted nature of the first installment, the long-delayed Tomb of the Dragon Emperor made The Mummy Returns look like a modern classic by comparison. One of the most overlooked aspects of the franchise was the sparkling chemistry between leads Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz, which always grounded the preposterous adventures thanks to some winning back and forth between the married O'Connells. After Weisz opted not to return for Rob Cohen's Tomb of the Dragon Emperor, Maria Bello was instead drafted in as her replacement, and while she made the right call in not trying to replicate the performance of her predecessor, her take on Evie was about as one-note as it got. When it comes to female leads in effects-driven blockbusters, the actress failed to bring anything even remotely interesting or memorable to the role. Number 4. Stuart Townsend, Queen of the Damned. Now, Stuart Townsend seems to have been either a very unfortunate actor or an incredibly difficult one to work with, depending on who you believe. As well as being replaced by Viggo Mortensen as Aragorn a day before The Lord of the Rings started shooting, he was cast as one of the Thor franchise's Warriors 3 before being booted by director Kenneth Branagh. Now, 2002's Queen of the Damned is remembered for being Alia's last movie before her tragic death, but Townsend plays the male lead as Lestat, a role previously embodied by Tom Cruise almost a decade beforehand in the vastly superior Interview with the Vampire. Suffice to say, Townsend is no Cruise, and his performance is as pale and anemic as the character that he plays. Unable to muster even an ounce of charisma or screen presence, all his performance in Queen of the Damned accomplished was making it clear that Peter Jackson may have well dodged a bullet in opting for Mortensen as Aragorn instead. Number 3. Tommy Lee Jones, Batman Forever. Now, Billy D. Williams had been quietly biding his time, knowing full well that when he signed on to play Harvey Dent in Tim Burton's Batman that there was every chance that he would end up villainous duties in a future installment as Two-Face. However, after abandoning plans to use the character in Batman Returns, Williams was left out of the movie completely, and when Joel Schumacher took over the franchise, he decided to cast Tommy Lee Jones instead, in what has to rank as one of the worst performances in the perma-scowling legend's entire career. In overacting stakes was definitely a poor choice, especially seeing as Jones famously detested his more exuberant co-star, and watching the two of them battle over who can chew the most scenery and shout the loudest makes Batman Forever an exhausting movie to sit through even a quarter of a century later. Surely to balance out Kerry's manic stylings, Billy D's effortless charm and charisma would have been a much better choice that could have helped ground the movie just a tiny bit. Number 2. Emilia Clarke and Jai Courtney, Terminator Jai Nice Ice. The Terminator franchise is no stranger to disappointing sequels, having delivered 4 in a row since James Cameron's Judgment Day back in 1991. And while there's strong evidence that Jai Nice Ice, and yes I will always call it that, was already well beyond saving, the 2 lead roles being woefully miscast did not help things at all. Previous installment Salvation was far from being a good movie, but Anton Yelchin's Kyle Reese was one of the undoubted highlights. Successor Jai Courtney failed miserably following in those footsteps, doing himself no favors when it came to his reputation as a charisma vacuum that sucked all of the energy out of any movie cursed by his mere presence. Thankfully that changed with the Suicide Squad, but still, that's a different story. Linda Hamilton made Sarah Connor an icon and a legendary action heroine, but Emilia Clarke's performance sets the character back at least 2 decades, and when you put her and Courtney together in the same scene, well, you end up with a pale imitation of classic characters reduced to stock personality traits that fans recognize, but without an ounce of chemistry, emotion, or believability about them. And number 1, George Clooney, Batman and Robin. George Clooney has spent over 2 decades bashing his own involvement in Batman and Robin, and while it didn't exactly turn him into Hollywood's next big action star as he was surely hoping at the time, it still worked out pretty well for the 2-time Academy Award-winning filmmaker and tequila mogul in the end. At this point, even the younger generation that hasn't even seen the movie will be aware of Batman and Robin's reputation as one of the worst comic book movies ever made, but the blame doesn't fall squarely on Clooney's shoulders, because the entire project was just riddled with flaws from top to bottom. Is he the worst live-action Batman? But you could also make the argument that not even Michael Keaton or Christian Bale would have been able to elevate the terrible material that he was given to work with. Not that Bale would have ever entertained the idea of lending his talents to something disguised exclusively to sell toys, mind you, but still, here we are. It's George Clooney. It's Batman and Robin. It stinks.